Two Allied armies hunted the same enemy in the same jungle, but one killed at arm's length, while the other fired from a football field away. One averaged 250 enemies dead for every soldier lost. The other burned 50,000 bullets per kill. The difference, exactly 95 meters of empty space and a philosophy learned in another war. In 1966, if you stood in the Phuoc Tuy province jungle and listened carefully, you could hear two different wars being fought. One was loud, mechanical, and relentless. The other was so quiet you might walk past it and never know men were dying 3 meters from your boots. The loud war belonged to the Americans. When they made contact with the Viet Cong, the jungle erupted. M16 rifles chattered on full automatic. M60 machine guns hammered at cyclic rates. M79 grenade launchers thumped their payloads into the green. Within minutes, radio operators screamed coordinates for artillery fire missions. Within hours, Huey gunships circled overhead, miniguns spinning up 6,000 rounds per minute. The Americans called it suppressive fire. The idea was simple. Put so much lead downrange that the enemy couldn't move, couldn't shoot back, couldn't do anything but die or run. Engagement distances averaged 50 to 100 meters, sometimes more. The doctrine came straight from the European theater of World War II and the frozen hills of Korea. Find the enemy. Fix him in place with overwhelming firepower. Destroy him with combined arms. It was industrial warfare transplanted into a guerrilla conflict, and it made sense on paper. American forces had the ammunition, the artillery, the air support. Why get close when you could stand back and hammer the enemy with everything in the arsenal? But the jungle had other ideas. At 100 meters in triple canopy rainforest, you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face half the time. Vegetation soaked up bullets like a sponge. Accuracy went to hell. The M16, designed for open terrain, struggled in the humidity and dirt. Soldiers fired entire magazines at muzzle flashes and shadows. Sometimes they hit something. Often they didn't. The noise carried for kilometers. Every firefight announced itself to every Viet Cong unit within earshot. They'd fade into spider holes and tunnel networks, wait for the Americans to pass, then pop up again behind them. The statistics told the story. American forces expended an estimated 50,000 rounds of small arms ammunition for every confirmed enemy kill. 50,000. That's not a typo. Some units did better, some did worse, but the average hovered in that neighborhood, and it drove the logistics officers insane. Mountains of ammunition flowed into Vietnam, got loaded onto helicopters, got humped through the jungle, and got sprayed into the trees. The body counts varied wildly depending on the unit, the terrain, the leadership. Some American formations were exceptional. Others were just trying to survive. Then there was the quiet war. The Australians operated differently. When the Special Air Service Regiment went into the bush, they moved like ghosts. 4 to 6 man patrols, sometimes smaller, slipping through vegetation without breaking a twig. They didn't look for firefights. They looked for tracks. When they found them, they followed. Not directly behind, that would be suicide, but parallel, shadowing, reading the signs like a language. How many men, how recent, where they were going, what they were carrying. The Australians could track a Viet Cong unit for days, sometimes weeks, never making contact, just gathering intelligence, waiting. When they did set an ambush, they set it close, 1 to 5 meters close. Close enough to see the sweat on a man's face. Close enough to count the wrinkles in his uniform. Close enough that when you pulled the trigger, there was no question about the outcome. The kill zone was a surgical thing. Every man in the patrol had a specific sector. Overlapping fields of fire, but controlled. No automatic weapons unless absolutely necessary. The SAS carried L1A1 SLR rifles, semi-automatic, heavy 7.62 millimeter rounds that dropped a man and kept him down. The ambush position was usually L-shaped or linear along a trail. The soldiers would lie in the undergrowth for hours, sometimes days, motionless. Insects crawled over them, leeches attached, muscles cramped. They didn't move, they barely breathed. When the enemy walked into the kill zone, the first shot was the signal. It was always a guaranteed kill. The patrol commander, usually the most experienced shooter, would take the lead target. The moment his rifle cracked, everyone else opened up. Not spraying, Shooting. Aimed fire at targets 5 meters away. The violence lasted 3 to 5 seconds. Then silence. Every enemy soldier in the kill zone was dead. 100% casualty rate. No wounded, no runners, just bodies. Then the Australians would move fast. Quick intelligence search, documents, maps, anything useful. Photographs of faces for identification, then out. Gone before the VC's friends even knew something had happened. No trace left behind except the dead. The numbers from these operations were almost obscene. Over the course of Australia's involvement in Vietnam, the SAS accounted for approximately 500 confirmed enemy kills in combat operations. They lost 2 men to enemy action in the same period. 2. The kill ratio worked out to roughly 250 to 1. That's not an exaggeration. That's documented history. How did that happen? How did a small force from a country most Americans couldn't find on a map achieve results that made elite American units look average? The answer started 12,000 kilometers away, 15 years earlier, in a different jungle. The Malayan emergency ran from 1948 to 1960. Communist insurgents, backed by China, tried to overthrow the British colonial government in Malaya. The jungle there was dense, wet, and murderous. The terrain favored the guerrillas completely. British and Australian forces fighting alongside Malayan troops had to learn jungle warfare from scratch. The insurgents knew the ground. They had popular support in some areas. They could disappear into the rainforest and pop up anywhere. The conventional tactics didn't work. Large unit sweeps just pushed the insurgents deeper into the jungle. Firepower accomplished nothing when you couldn't see the enemy. The Allied forces started adapting. They went smaller, patrol-sized elements. They learned to track. They learned to wait. They learned that in the jungle, patience killed more enemies than bullets. Australian forces were particularly good students. They took the lessons from Malaya and built them into doctrine. When the war ended in 1960 with the insurgency defeated, the Australians didn't forget. They built the Canungra Jungle Training Center in Queensland. Realistic jungle terrain, realistic training. The philosophy was simple and brutal. Get close or don't shoot. If you're not sure of the target, don't pull the trigger. If you can't kill with certainty, wait until you can. The training emphasized fieldcraft above everything. How to move silently, how to read tracks, how to set an ambush, how to wait for hours without moving, how to shoot once and hit. American soldiers who trained at Canungra later described it as the hardest school they'd ever attended. The standards were insane. If you made noise, you failed. If you were seen, you failed. If you missed the target, you failed. The Australians didn't care about volume of fire. They cared about results. When Australia deployed forces to Vietnam in 1962, and the SAS arrived in 1965, they brought that doctrine with them. The Americans noticed immediately. Australian patrols would be out for weeks, barely making contact, then suddenly report a successful ambush with no friendly casualties. The Vietnamese civilians in the operational areas noticed too. They started calling the Australians ghosts, because you never saw them until it was too late. The Viet Cong noticed most of all. Communist documents captured later in the war contained specific warnings about Australian patrols. The instructions were clear. Avoid contact if possible. If contact is unavoidable, break off immediately. Do not pursue. Do not attempt to recover bodies. The Australians had become the thing the VC feared most, an enemy that hunted them the way they hunted everyone else, only better. Let's walk through what an Australian ambush actually looked like on the ground. A 4-man patrol moves through the jungle. They've been out for 6 days. They found tracks on day 3, estimated squad-sized element, maybe 8 to 10 men moving supplies. The tracks are fresh. The patrol commander makes a decision. They'll set an ambush on a likely route. It takes them 4 hours to move 200 meters into position. Every step is deliberate. Every branch that might snap is avoided. They find a spot where the trail narrows between 2 large trees. Perfect choke point. The commander positions his men in an L shape. 2 on one side of the trail, 2 on the other side at a 45-degree angle. Every man has a sector. Overlapping fire, but each soldier is responsible for specific targets. They wait. 14 hours. Motionless. A soldier feels something crawl into his ear. He doesn't move. Another has a leg cramp so bad he wants to scream. He doesn't move. They breathe slowly, shallowly. They watch the trail through the vegetation. They listen. Just after dawn, they hear it. Footsteps, multiple people, moving carefully, but not carefully enough. The Australian soldiers see them now. 8 men, wearing black pajamas and carrying AK-47s. They're talking quietly. One is smoking. They're 5 meters away. 4 meters. 3. The commander has the lead man in his sights. Center mass. The Viet Cong soldier is looking right at his position, seeing nothing. 2 meters now. The VC is fully in the kill zone. So is the second man. 3rd, 4th, all of them. The commander fires. The lead VC drops like his strings were cut. Instantly, 3 more shots crack almost simultaneously. 4 bodies down. The remaining VC start to react, bringing weapons up, but they're too slow. 4 more shots. 8 bodies on the trail. The entire engagement took 4 seconds. The Australians move immediately. They search quickly. One VC was carrying a leather satchel with documents, maps, orders, valuable. Photos are taken of faces. Serial numbers from weapons are recorded. 2 minutes. Then they're moving perpendicular to the trail into thick vegetation, erasing their tracks. 20 minutes later, they're 600 meters away, lying still again, listening. No pursuit. No reaction. The jungle is silent. They radio in the contact. 8 confirmed kills. No friendly casualties, no ammunition expended except 8 rounds. The American liaison officer on the other end of the radio has to ask them to repeat it. 8 rounds? For 8 kills? Roger that. This wasn't a unique operation. This was standard procedure. This was what the SAS did, over and over, patrol after patrol throughout the war. The Americans were paying attention, some of them anyway. The problem was that changing doctrine isn't like flipping a switch. The U.S. military in Vietnam was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of troops, complex logistics, established training pipelines. Most American soldiers got their combat training at places like Fort Benning in Georgia. The instruction focused on conventional warfare, platoon and company-sized operations, fire and maneuver, combined arms. It was good training for the wrong war. Some units figured it out faster than others. The long-range reconnaissance patrols, the LRRPs, were naturals for the Australian approach. They already operated in small teams. They already emphasized stealth over firepower. When they got the chance to train with Australian units or attended courses at Canungra, they soaked it up like sponges. Their effectiveness went through the roof. Kill ratios improved. Casualties dropped. After-action reports started reading like Australian SAS reports. Short, brutal engagements at close range with no friendly losses. Ranger units adapted too. Special Forces, the Green Berets, they were already thinking along similar lines from their own counterinsurgency doctrine. The more they worked with the Australians, the more their tactics converged. There are stories of American advisors literally rewriting their tactical manuals based on what they learned from Australian patrol commanders. But institutional change is slow, especially during a war. Most American infantry units kept doing what they'd been trained to do: search and destroy operations with large formations, heavy reliance on firepower, radio calls for support at the first sign of contact. It wasn't that the tactics were wrong exactly. They just weren't optimized for the environment. A squad of Americans might bump into a VC patrol in the jungle, immediately open up with everything they had, call in artillery and gunships, and end up with a handful of confirmed kills and a jungle full of noise. A squad of Australians might track that same VC patrol for 2 days, set up an ambush at point-blank range, kill every single one of them silently, and be gone before anyone knew they'd been there. The contrast showed up in strange ways. American and Australian units sometimes operated in adjacent areas. The Americans would report constant contact, heavy firefights, medevac requests, ammunition resupply needs. The Australians in the next province over would report weeks of silence, then a brief contact with total enemy casualties. American commanders sometimes thought the Australians were avoiding combat. Then they'd see the body counts in the intelligence halls and realize the Australians were just fighting a completely different war. There's a famous example from August 1966, the Battle of Long Tan. An Australian company, D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, got caught in the open by a Viet Cong regiment. Over 2,000 VC against 108 Australians. It wasn't an SAS operation, it was conventional infantry, but the Australian training and discipline showed through. Instead of panicking and calling for immediate extraction, they formed a tight defensive position. Instead of spraying ammunition, they fired controlled aimed shots. They held off wave after wave of VC assaults for hours in a rubber plantation during a monsoon rainstorm. When it was over, the Australians had lost 18 men. The Viet Cong lost over 240 confirmed, with estimates of total casualties reaching 500 or more. The kill ratio, even in a desperate defensive battle, still favored the Australians by an order of magnitude. The VC learned to avoid Australian units after Long Tan. They learned even faster to avoid the SAS. There are intercepted radio transmissions from later in the war, where VC commanders specifically tell their units to pull back if they see signs of Australian presence. That's the ultimate compliment in warfare, when your enemy changes his plans just because you might be in the area. So why didn't the Americans just adopt the whole Australian system? Why didn't the doctrine change army-wide? Partly it was scale. Australia had a few thousand troops in Vietnam at peak deployment. The United States had over 500,000. You can't retrain that many soldiers in the middle of a war. The logistics alone would be impossible. Training facilities like Canungra could only handle small numbers. Sending every American soldier through jungle warfare school would take years. Partly it was institutional inertia. The U.S. Army had doctrine that had won World War II and held the line in Korea. That doctrine was built around firepower and combined arms. Changing it meant admitting it wasn't optimal, and large organizations don't like admitting that. There were generals who genuinely believed the American approach was correct, and the Australian success was just statistical noise or luck. Partly it was cultural. American military culture valued aggression and offensive action. The Australian approach required patience and restraint, qualities that didn't always align with American expectations. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, of an American officer observing an Australian patrol and complaining that they were too passive because they'd tracked an enemy unit for 3 days without engaging. The Australian commander supposedly replied that they were waiting for the entire enemy unit to be in the kill zone at once, which happened the next day, resulting in 17 confirmed kills with no friendly casualties. The American officer apparently didn't have a response to that. But some units did change. The lessons spread through personal networks. An American soldier would serve with an Australian unit as a liaison, learn their methods, then bring those methods back to his own platoon. A special forces team would attend training at Canungra, then teach those techniques to the local forces they were advising. LRRPs would compare notes with SAS patrols in base camps, swapping tactics and tricks. By 1969 and 1970, you could see the influence in American operations. More emphasis on reconnaissance, more patience before initiating contact, more controlled fire discipline. Units that had adapted showed dramatically better results. Lower casualties, higher kill ratios, better intelligence collection. The soldiers themselves knew it worked because they stayed alive longer. But here's the thing that really matters. The thing that keeps this story from being a simple tale of tactical superiority. None of it changed the outcome of the war. The Australians could achieve 250 to 1 kill ratios. American units that learned from them could triple or quadruple their effectiveness. It didn't matter. Vietnam wasn't a war that would be won by tactics. It was a strategic failure from the beginning. The United States never defined a clear, achievable political objective. The enemy had unlimited strategic patience. North Vietnam would absorb casualties that would destroy any Western nation and keep fighting. The Viet Cong would fade into the population. Impossible to separate from civilians without committing atrocities. You could track perfectly. You could ambush flawlessly. You could kill at 1 meter or 100 meters. But unless you could hold ground permanently, build a stable South Vietnamese government, and convince the population to support it, you were just adding to the body count. And body count was a meaningless metric in a war where the enemy didn't care about losses as long as they outlasted you. The Tet Offensive in 1968 proved it. The Americans and South Vietnamese won every major tactical engagement. The Viet Cong got massacred. But the strategic impact went to the Communists because they proved they could strike anywhere, anytime, even at the height of American military presence. The American public saw the fighting on television and asked what all the casualties had accomplished. The answer was nothing durable. The Australians understood this, at least some of them did. Their tactical excellence couldn't compensate for strategic failure. They could make their area of operations extremely dangerous for the Viet Cong. They could gather exceptional intelligence. They could achieve remarkable efficiency in their missions. But they couldn't build a nation. They couldn't create political legitimacy. They couldn't make the South Vietnamese government less corrupt or more popular. When American forces withdrew and the Australians went with them, all that tactical expertise evaporated. The South Vietnamese army had some well-trained units, some that had learned from the Australians, some that had learned from the Americans. It didn't matter. When North Vietnamese tanks rolled south in 1975, tactics meant nothing. Morale collapsed. Political will collapsed. Saigon fell. But the lessons didn't disappear. The Australian SAS methods became part of special operations doctrine worldwide. When American special forces evolved in the 80s and 90s, you could see the Australian influence. Patient reconnaissance, small unit tactics, precision over firepower. The idea that sometimes the best weapon is the one you don't fire until you're absolutely certain. The British SAS obviously shared the same roots, coming from the same Malayan emergency crucible. New Zealand's Special Air Service, same story. These tactics spread to counterterrorism units, hostage rescue teams, anyone operating in environments where precision mattered more than volume of fire. Modern military forces train differently now. Jungle warfare schools emphasize stalking and ambush skills. Marksmanship standards focus on first-round hits. Fire discipline is taught from day one. The idea that you need to burn thousands of rounds to kill one enemy is recognized as wasteful and counterproductive. Not because it's immoral, though there are moral arguments, but because it doesn't work. It alerts the enemy. It wastes ammunition. It reduces accuracy. There's a technical aspect that's worth understanding too. At 100 meters in jungle, your probability of hit with a rifle is maybe 20 to 30% if you're good. You fire a 30-round magazine, you might hit the target 3 to 9 times if you're lucky. More likely you hit them once or twice or miss entirely. At 5 meters, your probability of hit approaches 100%. Every shot connects. You fire 8 rounds from an 8-man patrol, you get 8 kills. The mathematics are brutal but clear. The psychological aspect is different too. Killing at 100 meters is impersonal. You're shooting at shapes and sounds. Killing at 5 meters is intimate. You see the person. That takes a different kind of discipline, a different kind of training. The Australians trained their soldiers for that psychological burden. They understood that close-range killing was harder mentally, but more effective tactically. They prepared their troops for the emotional weight. There's also the aftermath consideration. A firefight at 100 meters might wound several enemies who escape and get treated. A close-range ambush leaves no wounded. That sounds brutal, and it is, but it's also more humane in a twisted way. Quick death versus slow death from wounds. It's also more effective strategically, because dead enemies don't report your position, don't escape to fight later, don't require medical resources from their side. The moral calculus of war is always ugly. But if you're going to fight, if you're going to kill, the Australian argument was, do it efficiently. Make it count. Don't waste ammunition and lives on noise and fury that accomplishes nothing. Be professional. Be precise. Be deadly. That philosophy carried over to how they treated the battlefield. American operations sometimes left areas devastated. Artillery craters everywhere. Vegetation shredded. The landscape itself announced that combat had happened there. Australian operations left almost no trace. The bodies on the trail might be the only evidence. That had intelligence value. If the enemy doesn't know where you are or how you operate, they can't adapt. The mystery is a weapon itself. Vietnam War historians sometimes miss this story because it doesn't fit the standard narrative. The narrative says, American firepower was overwhelming and ineffective. The Australian counterexample complicates that. It suggests that the problem wasn't firepower itself, but how it was applied. The narrative says guerrilla warfare requires hearts and minds campaigns. The Australian SAS succeeded through pure tactical excellence without much emphasis on winning hearts and minds in their operational areas. They just made it extremely dangerous to be Viet Cong. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Tactics matter. Training matters. Doctrine matters, but strategy matters more. The best tactics in the world can't compensate for strategic incoherence. The Australians proved you could fight the jungle war effectively. They didn't prove you could win it, because winning required political solutions that military force couldn't provide. But on the tactical level, on the level of patrol versus patrol, soldier versus soldier, the lesson is clear. Distance in jungle warfare is a choice. You can engage at 100 meters with uncertain results and high ammunition expenditure, or you can close to 5 meters with certain results and minimal expenditure. The second option requires more skill, more training, more patience, and more courage. But it works. The numbers prove it. 250 to 1 versus 50,000 rounds per kill. That's not a small difference. That's not a rounding error. That's two completely different approaches to warfare yielding two completely different results. Same war, same enemy, same jungle, different philosophy, different outcome. The Viet Cong knew the difference. They knew which Allied forces to fear most. It wasn't the ones with the most firepower, or the most soldiers or the most helicopters. It was the ones who got close, shot straight, and left no trace. The ones who turned the jungle into a hunting ground, where the hunter could become the hunted. The ones who understood that in war, sometimes 95 meters of distance, is the difference between a firefight and an execution. That's what the Australian SAS understood. That's what they taught to anyone willing to learn. That's why their kill ratio looked impossible. It wasn't impossible. It was just the result of doing one thing very well, getting close enough that you couldn't miss, and having the discipline to wait for that perfect moment even if it took days. In the end, the quiet war was deadlier than the loud one. The ghosts killed more efficiently than the thunder. And that's a lesson that still echoes in special operations forces around the world. When you watch modern warfare, when you see special forces operate, you're seeing the inheritors of that doctrine. Patient, professional, precise, deadly. The descendants of men who learned to hunt in the Malayan jungle and perfected it in Vietnam. The men who proved that sometimes the best way to win a gunfight is to make sure the enemy never knows you're there until it's too late to matter. If you found this story valuable, hit that subscribe button to join us for more untold military history. Drop a like if you appreciate deep tactical analysis, and leave a comment below telling us which military doctrine or historical operation you'd like us to cover next. Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten lessons to light.